there's something deep and horrible about that because, people think that when you're in a totalitarian state, the reason that the state is totalitarian because everyone is the victim of top-down pressure from tyrants. And that's not how it works at all. A state becomes totalitarian when every single person is lying about absolutely everything all the time. And you said that you started to experience that in New York because you had to pretend all the time. You had to watch your language. You had to couch what you say and you did because you were afraid of how other people would react. And that is the totalitarian ethos. And when that's distributed across the population in general, you still have tyrants who are in control, but they're just mouthpieces of that more generalized lie. And, I've traveled a lot in the last 3 or 4 years, and I've been in places that were very woke, especially on the lockdown front. And I would say Toronto was first and foremost among them, worse than New York, worse than San Francisco, worse than LA, worse than Washington. A sense of real oppression descended on me arriving, say, back in Toronto airports, and a sense of real freedom emerged going to places like, Tennessee, Texas, Florida, where I could say what the hell I wanted and everyone wasn't half insane with mask frenzy and the associated COVID authoritarianism. And I'm more and more convinced that there was no damn pandemic at all. I'm convinced on that front, not least in part because there's not a lot of data showing excess mortality in Sweden, for example, during the pandemic years. What we had instead, and conservatives should probably stop talking about the pandemic as such, what we had was an outbreak of 2 years of totalitarian governance, and that was the bloody pandemic. It was a lot worse than the virus by any stretch of the imagination, and there were some places that managed to stay relatively free of that. Tennessee is a good example, but so is Florida. You can go there and there is a sense of lightness that's, I think it's palpable on landing. And maybe it's because the airports aren't quite as authoritarian as they are in the more lockdown-oriented states and provinces.
It's true. I remember landing in New York on, various trips during that time, and there would be National Guard there, asking you where you're going. The idea that would be happening in America is wild. And you're right. It is look, I don't want to discount. When I say it's similar to my parents leaving the Soviet Union, it's similar because I'm moving towards freedom, just like they were. And maybe we didn't come from the same terrible totalitarian system, but we both felt the social pressure to conform. And I didn't want to conform anymore. I wanted to be free. I cannot tell you how many well-known, famous people were in my direct messages during that time saying, I agree with you, but I can't say anything. How many news people in the media who are like, yeah, I think schools should be open, but I'm afraid to say anything. Well, in the beginning, I felt sorry for them. And I was like, I would respond like, I get it. I understand you can't speak out. But after a while, I came to really hate them and think like, you can't speak out about really basic things that are affecting your children and other children. And you can't speak out because what? You're going to get a nasty comment on Facebook. It's just, I came to lose so much respect for people who were conforming even when they didn't have to.
Yeah, well, I felt the same thing with regard to the professoriate and the influx of the woke administrators. Yeah. It's like, look, you guys, you have tenure. You are the most protected people in the world.
Right, be brave.
You have this privileged position. Well, it's your, uphold your bloody ethical responsibility. The price you pay for your tenured privilege is the requirement that you speak your mind at whatever risk that poses to you. Now, the culture has done everything it possibly could to ameliorate that risk for you. Everything it can. And yet you don't have enough courage to oppose, the HR person who's pushing forward a diversity, inclusivity, and equity proposal. It's like, well, we can't say anything about that. We have to go along with what the administration wants. What happened in the universities, it's so interesting to watch. And I watched this over a 30-year period. The first thing that happened was the administration took over the universities. And that's well documented. All you have to do is look at the statistics that show how much the administration increased in terms of sheer numbers compared to how much the professoriate or the student body increased. And you see a massive increase in administrators and no a slight increase in students and almost no increase whatsoever in faculty. And the reason that happened was because the administrators pushed, and they could see a good thing when they had one, and they figured out how to pick the future pockets of their students in a parasitical manner. And so that's on the administrators, but the faculty allowed it to happen, just like the bloody Republicans have allowed the woke mob to take over the education system. Exactly the same thing. So it's on the faculty as far as I'm concerned. Cowards. 1,000 micro retreats or 10,000 micro retreats. But then what happened, and this was so bloody interesting, is that once the administrators had taken over the university, the woke mob used the same tactics to take over the administration. And it probably took 30 years for the administrators to take over the university. It took like 4 years for the woke mob to take over the administration. And that's where we are now. And that's, for me, that's 100% on the faculty.